Hello everyone and welcome back to the Great Book of Grudges. My name is Nathan and we're back with another Total War Warhammer video. We're once again back with Warhammer 1 as we're continuing our 5 years later series, this time with the vampire counts, as we started the series and then I got a tad busy with cafe news and so on, but I figured whilst we are waiting for more news to drop, we might as well start focusing on this series. So let's not waste any more time and check out how the vampire counts have changed over the years and what they could benefit from in the future. The vampire counts were a base game faction for Warhammer 1, meaning that they started with two legendary lords, Manfred von Carstein and Heinrich Kemmler, both very popular characters from the tabletop. In fact, Manfred is quite hated at the moment, but that's due to his end times lore. Prior to that, in 8th edition and before, he was actually extremely popular. Both of them had their own specializations. Manfred himself was a vampire and a very powerful spellcaster, whereas Heinrich was a very powerful necromancer. It was very obvious as to why those two characters were picked for the vampire counts at the beginning of the game, as, well, the game was focused around the old world, and both Heinrich and Manfred have a lot to do around this area. Like pretty much most factions in Warhammer 1, the vampire counts were introduced in a more historical Total War sense. Yes, obviously the vampire counts rely on magic and flying monsters quite heavily, but the idea of the gameplay was very similar to that of historical Total War. It was pretty much just build up your armies and go. There was nothing too different about them, no unique mechanics or anything, barring of course just the raise the dead mechanic. So if you were familiar with baseline Total War stuff, you were pretty much okay with this. This later changed with future races and factions, but it's a format which naturally was very common in Warhammer 1 and then changed heavily in Warhammer 2. There were of course some changes when it came to battlefield mechanics, as the vampires were fairly unique back at this time, taking direct inspiration from how the vampire counts and other undead factions and demons work on the tabletop, where your armies will not retreat, your undead armies at least. Instead, they'll fight to the very last, and if their leadership drops too low, they'll start to crumble instead of fleeing. This means that your army will stay into the fight longer, but eventually will start beginning to disintegrate. This is a mechanic that we're all pretty much used to at this point, as we've seen it of course with the vampire counts, the Tomb Kings, the Vampire Coast, and we're heavily expecting this with the demons. The raise dead mechanic is also quite unique, but familiar at the same time, if that makes sense. How it works is that you have an instant recruitment pool when you go to different locations if there's been enough fighting, and sometimes when there's been no fighting at all. When there has been a lot of fighting, you'll see a location known as a famous battle site, and what this means is if an area has a lot of famous battle sites, you'll start to notice a lot of higher tier troops. Rather than being able to recruit basic zombies and skeletons, you'll be able to recruit blood knights and terrorgeists and even some other big monsters. It works very similar to that of the old school historical mercenary mechanic, where different regions that you'll go to, you'll have access to different units, but this is obviously linked to just one race, and yeah, it does work quite well. It does give the vampire factions a lot of an edge here, because if other races start fighting, they will generate these battle sites and it will come to your benefit. Though this of course is very advantageous for one specific reason. The vampire count roster, this is of course the vanilla one with no DLC attached to it whatsoever, was obviously just focused on melee combat. A mixture of slow lumbering hordes, some fast moving monsters, and of course some incredibly fast and terrifying flyers. No range whatsoever, and we won't see any range until the specific mechanic comes into play later in Warhammer 2, but that's how the vampires played on the tabletop. Yes, they did have some range units way back in the day, but as they evolved, they had more of a stylized play like this. Hordes and monsters, and that's pretty much it. A lot of people did enjoy this type of playstyle back on the tabletop. I was a big fan myself, and I was always curious to see how it was going to be done here, because obviously there is a bit of a range meta, though they are able to do it quite well, and you are able to play as the vampires without too many issues, and it is easily said that the vampire counts are one of the easiest factions to play due to certain mechanics. The original vampire count tech tree has really not changed over the years, and more or less stays the same when it comes to Warhammer 2. In fact, the earlier stuff was more focused around minor buffs. You wouldn't be able to get your free skeleton doomstacks or zombies doomstacks, but you could reduce their upkeep upkeep and make them a little stronger, and everything is continuing pretty much as expected. The Book of Archon focuses around skeleton zombies and, of course, Graveguard. The Liber Necronomica focuses around undead ghosts and sometimes crypt ghouls and crypt fiends. The Lemian Book of Blood focuses around administration of your settlements, towns, and regions. And finally, the Blasphemous Bestiary focuses around, well, your beasts. In terms of characters, Manfred himself was received very well, popular character as I said earlier in the video, and has received some quality of life changes over time, but really needed no changes whatsoever as he starts in his lore-friendly position, has a playstyle which is expected of him, and generally is exactly how he's supposed to be from tabletop and lore perspective. He was honestly done very, very well. Heinrich, on the other hand, did suffer, as many of the second banana characters did for the Warhammer races, where he started in the same location, meaning that there was no reason to really play the vampire counts again. This was an issue for the vampire counts for quite some time, and in fact, this became a bit of a problem, as Sylvania is quite the mosh pit and still very much is by the end of the lifespan of Warhammer 2. Not only that, but Heinrich was just not too fun. Necromancer-based legendary lords are fairly weak. Now, in lore, he had access to Krell, but this wasn't always the case in Warhammer 1. Krell was actually introduced as an FLC a little bit after, which made no sense to me whatsoever, and is still in the weirdest position in the whole franchise. You see, Krell was introduced as a weird pseudo-legendary hero, attached to this weird skill tree, which would actually be less beneficial to you, as you spent a lot of skills which gave you no benefits rather than just boosting up Krell's capabilities, and that's pretty much it. It was 5 skills in total, and well, yeah, you know, that's actually a decent amount of skills considering that lords don't level too high, especially that they didn't in Warhammer 1. This was drastically changed in Warhammer 2. It's still a skill line, but less dependent on putting so many skills in one specific area, and it focuses around his own unique skill line, meaning that he'll get a lot more bonuses. This fixed up the issue and became much more user-friendly, plus, well, you know, Krell's quite powerful, so you actually do want to use him if you ever have Heinrich. Heinrich was also moved to be closer to Bretonnia, his own unique start and his own unique faction known as the Barrow Legion. It gave you more of an incentive to replay as the vampire counts, as now you had a completely different area to start off with and thus had new ways to play. It's still not great, as it's still very much centered in the old world, but we'll talk about that in a little bit. The vampire counts did get a decent amount of content, DLC and FLC throughout the rather short lifespan of Warhammer 1. Only one DLC so far has been attached to the Warhammer Fantasy vampire counts. Known as the Grim in the Grave, it introduced a few units such as the Mortis engine, which was quite needed for the vampire counts in all honesty, and a legendary lord who goes by the name of Helmengorst, a absolute nobody in the franchise who appeared in one campaign pack in Warhammer Fantasy. Don't get me wrong, mechanically, especially in Warhammer 2, he's a fun character to play and possibly a better choice than Manfred in certain occasions, but yeah, still unknown character in a very massive universe with loads of established vampire count characters. His introduction, especially as he came along with Volkmar the Grim, was extremely confusing, where, yeah, anyone but him would have been great. I'm not saying that Helmengorst was an absolute mistake, he should have been added in eventually if they had plans for him, but more so as a legendary hero than a legendary lord, because he still takes up a slot in Sylvania, as he is bound to Manfred. He is actually a student of Manfred's and lore, and it just makes no sense as to why this character, especially with the old world being so big and so many different vampires they could have chosen. Unfortunately, we're stuck with him until the end of days, because Creative Assembly said that they don't really want to go over certain characters and just like get rid of them or, you know, change them to something else like a legendary hero. And yeah, fair play, he's a good character, he is fun to play, but he could have literally been anyone else. In fact, we already had a Necromancer character, they could have gone with a different bloodline. The Sylvanian mosh pit was further enhanced by the introduction of 2 new legendary lords. The founders of the Sylvanian bloodline, to be in fact, that of Vlad von Carstein and Isabella von Carstein, the power duo which were introduced as a new separate faction. This means for the first time ever, unless you were using mods of course, you could now play a co-op campaign with a friend and both of you could play vampires. Now the thing is, this was also also quite the surprise. Yes, they are massive fan favorites, but they've been long dead in the lore. This is one of the cases, well, one of many cases where lore has been changed or broken by Creative Assembly. I'm not complaining, I'm just pointing it out there. The dynamic between Vlad and Isabella was also very interesting, as you'd want to keep them together and make them fight alongside each other. On a personal opinion, it would have been better if they would have been a Lord and a hero option, as Vlad being the Lord and Isabella being the hero, so they could always be together. But, you know, two Lords, pretty good. You actually end up having two armies moving together at all times. It's not really needed, as the benefits aren't really that good, but it's lore friendly and it's thematic, and that's really the most important thing. When Bretonnia was released as an FLC race, we also saw the introduction of the Red Duke of Aquitaine, for some reason in Musalon, which makes no sense, but let's move on. The Red Duke is a very interesting character, very similar to that of Boris Todbringer. He's a very well-known character. In fact, the Red Duke has a pretty cool book, and he has a unique model. The fact is, he's not been made as a properly playable legendary lord with a unique start position for, well, we're still waiting. Creative Assembly did mention that eventually he'll see his day, but yeah, we're about, 5 years into the series and still nothing, which is an absolute shame because he's a cool character, and it would be interesting to see some Bretonnian reskins and see how a mix of Bretonnian and vampire counts would play. Of course, there's a very popular mod to be able to do that, but a lot of people do want an official way, and obviously to see him properly voiced. One day we'll be able to play as him. I don't know if I'm going to be alive for that, or I'm just going to die of old age, but hey, we're going to have to wait and see. And now we move on to Warhammer 2, where we still have 5 playable legendary lords, which are for the Vampire Count faction. 4 of them attached to the von Carstein bloodline, as Helman Gorst is a student, as I said before, and obviously Heinrich has now been moved, and now has his own faction. It's very clear that someone at Creative Assembly really likes the von Carstein bloodline. We have seen the introduction of new vampires, however, but through their own race pack, the Vampire Coast. We've got Luther Harkin, who obviously is part of the Blood Dragon bloodline, but he's obviously lost his mind, and Nikolaus von Carstein. Sorry, Count Noctilus. Yep, another von Carstein, because popular. Both of them play very differently, but do share some very similar mechanics, as of course vampires are still vampires. Technology for the vampire counts hasn't really changed over the years. We've seen a few additions here and there, just adding in some quality of life changes too, like for example the very famous skeleton and zombie no upkeep mechanics. But other than that, it's pretty much stayed the same. Admittedly, the technology tree might be a little small, but then again, I guess it's just because the vampires still need a bit of a rework. Yes, they've had one before, which we're going to cover in just a bit, but they're still kinda lacking. Since their rework, they did get access to a new resource known as Blood Kissers. These are gained from vassalizing factions, assassinating characters, technologies, and faction leaders killed in battle. The new resource is exclusively used in the new Bloodline mechanic, so let's just check that out. The Bloodlines mechanic is actually really fun. As you get these kisses, then you can use them to unlock legendary lords, well, pseudo-legendary lords, and get a bunch of benefits towards your faction as a whole too. It's extremely lore-friendly. As you see, there are 5 main bloodlines in the Warhammer Fantasy universe for vampire counts, and this is represented here, where you're able to recruit a different pseudo-legendary lord respective of their proper bloodline, where they have their own unique models. Some of them are indeed reskins, but they look different, they play differently, and it's just something really cool, which harkens back to 6th edition Warhammer Fantasy battles. The first tier of each of the pseudo-lords will cost 3 blood kisses, and the price will increase and increase as you go to the 2nd and 3rd tier. This means that you're not going to be able to unlock everything quite quickly, but this also means that you have access to 15 new pseudo-legendary lords. It means that the vampire counts have more than the Skaven, so if you would like to complain about the Skaven, there's a bigger issue here, because the vampire counts still need a lot more content, and this adds to it too. With complete honesty, this was a fantastic addition to the vampire counts, as they desperately needed some diversity in terms of different bloodlines, as we've still not really received any different bloodline legendary lords, and we're still waiting despite it being 5 years later and loads of possible chances being introduced with pretty much like right in the face, like yeah, perfect now, but not happening. But here we are at the end of Warhammer 2's lifespan, and yeah, the vampire counts still need quite a bit. When it comes to units, they're almost perfectly fine. In fact, most of their known possible units have already been introduced, with a few missing, so there is room for a DLC or two. However, they will desperately be in need of character packs the same way as the Empire would. As I'm scrolling around through the Immortal Empires map, you can see here that there's a lot of different areas where vampires can be introduced. If you're not too familiar with the lore, pretty much anywhere that I'm looking at could have a possible vampire count legendary lord in the circular motion that I'm following. There's just so many possible different locations, and in fact we were expecting something coming soon. You know, they even added in the Silver Pinnacle for Neferata, and we still don't have Neferata, and as far as we're aware, we're moving on straight into Warhammer 3. I don't know what that's all about, considering that there are so many characters, and yet we only have proper representation from one bloodline, and of course the Necromancers. There are still 4 other bloodlines which still don't have legendary lords, and could really make Creative Assembly a lot of money. Vampire counts are very, very popular, and well, yeah, it's just something that really bothers me. Hopefully we'll be able to see other vampire count bloodlines introduced into the game, as it would be a massive shame if all we saw was Von Carstein. Don't make the same mistake that Games Workshop did when it came to the 8th edition army book, where all identity from the vampire counts was lost and all the bloodlines played exactly the same way. But with all that being said, we've gone over the vampire counts now, and yeah, all they're pretty much missing is legendary characters. What do you guys think about this? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below, and let's start a bit of a discussion. You guys seem to be enjoying the series, which, you know, is always pretty cool, and yeah, I'm enjoying it too. But with that, my friends, we've come to the end of our video. Thank you so much for watching. If you did enjoy the video, might I suggest giving the video a like, or even subscribing to the channel, as it really does help us out. In the description section below are various links to different social media platforms such as Facebook, Instagram, and Discord. Also in the description section is an affiliate link with Element Games, where you could buy loads of hobby-based products, not just Warhammer, for 10 to 25% off. Making a purchase using that link and also our special code, which is also in the description, supports the channel at no extra cost to you, which we think is rather cool. A big thank you to our patrons. Your support means the world to us. It's amazing that people want to help a small channel like us grow and get to a higher level of content. A big thank you to Gibraltar LUSC, Ryan Bertsche, Andrew Prince, and Okro for subscribing to us at our Fane level. You guys are super cool. And a big thank you to Edward Yule, VS Vasan, Aaron Whitman, and Shaggy for subscribing to us at our King level. Honestly, we can't thank you all enough. And lastly, a big thank you to all of you for liking, sharing, and commenting on these videos. Honestly, it's because of you guys that the channel's been growing at such a great pace lately, so we can't thank you all enough. But with that, my friends, thank you so much for watching once again, and we shall see you all again very, very soon. Have a good day.